The name came on a Thursday. Not dramatically. Not with a phone call in the middle of the night or a stranger at the door or any of the cinematic delivery methods I had unconsciously been bracing for over the 6 weeks since the arrangement was reinstated and the terms were agreed and my father went back to his house and his tomatoes and concrete the ancient Labrador with the particular lightness of a man who has set down something he was never supposed to carry alone. It came in an envelope. Plain white. No return address. Slipped through our letterbox at some point between 7 and 8 on a Thursday morning while I was upstairs getting ready for school and Zale was downstairs making coffee and Bruschetta was completing her morning patrol of the windowsills with the focused authority of someone who takes perimeter checks very seriously and has never once been thanked for it. Zale brought it upstairs. He stood in the doorway of the bathroom while I was brushing my teeth and he held it out and said, "This came," in the particular tone he used when something required my attention, but he was waiting for me to set the pace of how we approached it. I looked at it in the mirror. I rinsed. I dried my face. I took the envelope. One piece of paper inside. I could tell from the weight of it. I stood there holding it and I thought about Cleo. I thought about her at our wedding carrying bruschetta in a bag because she thought it was funny, and it became funny, and then it became one of the best photographs I own. I thought about 11 years of her. The full accumulated weight of 11 years of someone who knew you completely and chose you anyway. And then I opened the envelope. One name. Handwritten in clean, precise letters. No explanation. No apology. No additional information of any kind. Just a name. I read it once. Then again. I sat down on the edge of the bath. Zale was very still in the doorway, giving me space to land while making sure I didn't land too hard. It was something he had always done without naming it, and something I had always received without examining it, and something I understood now with the full weight of what it had always cost him to do it. I said, "Do you know this name?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Did you know before?" He said, "I suspected." I wanted to be certain before I said anything to you. I was building toward certain. I looked at the name on the paper. David Rell. Not a stranger. That was the thing I had not prepared for, which in retrospect was naive, because nothing in the previous 2 months had been a stranger, and I should have understood by now that this story had no interest in clean distances between people. David Rell had been Cleo's colleague at the financial consulting firm that was not entirely a financial consulting firm. I had known her for 9 years in the way you know the peripheral people in someone else's life, present at occasions, familiar enough to greet warmly, never quite central. She had come to Cleo's funeral and stood 3 rows behind me and cried in a way that I had found, at the time, genuinely moving. She had sent me a handwritten card afterward. "She is the best of us," it said. "I think about her every day." I had kept that card in a drawer because it felt true. I sat on the edge of the bath for a long time. Zale came and sat next to me. Not speaking. Not filling the silence with the things people say when they don't know what else to offer. Just sitting next to me the way he sat next to everything, fully and without terms. I said, "Eventually, she cried at the funeral." He said, "I know." I said, "She sent me a card." He said, "I know." I said, "What happens to her now?" He said, "It goes through Vale's network. Documented, evidenced, irrefutable. She will not be able to make it disappear." I said, "Good." I folded the paper, put it in my pocket, stood up and looked at myself in the bathroom mirror for a moment. At the face of a woman who had found a phone in a coat pocket 6 weeks ago looking for chocolate and had arrived here, at this mirror, at this Thursday morning, by the most indirect and costly route imaginable. I said quietly, to my own reflection, not performing it, just saying it, "Okay, Cleo." "Okay." I picked up my bag. I went to school. I taught 2 periods. During the first, I was mostly present because Fenwick had attempted to create a mixed media piece using materials that were not strictly art supplies, and the situation required genuine intervention. During the second period, I thought about David Rell continuously and with enough sustained focus that I gave the wrong project brief entirely and had to restart the lesson from the beginning while my teaching assistant Priya watched me with the careful expression of someone who has noticed something is wrong and is far too professional to say so. At lunch, I sat in my car in the school car park and called my father. He answered on the first ring. He had been doing that since everything happened. A small recalibration that told me he was paying different attention to what the phone could mean now. I said, "We got the name." A pause. He said, "Are you all right?" I said, "I knew them." A longer pause. He said, "I know." "I'm sorry." I said, "Did you know before?" He said, "A suspicion only." I wanted to be wrong. I said, "You and Zale both had a suspicion and neither of you told me." He said, "Yes. We were both wrong not to." I said, "You are both still learning." He said, "We are." I said, "I'm not collapsing, Dad. I just needed to tell someone who understood what Cleo meant before I go back in and teach the afternoon." He said, "I understand what she meant." I said, "She cried at the funeral." He said, very quietly, "I know." We stayed on the phone in silence for a moment, which was its own kind of conversation, and then I said I would call him Sunday, and hung up and went back inside. I taught my afternoon classes. I drove home. I want to be honest about what I felt pulling into our street that evening because I think it matters. I did not feel broken. I felt the specific weight of a grief that had been given a shape it didn't have before, which is not the same as new grief, but is its own kind of heavy. Cleo's death had been shapeless for 14 months, a terrible random thing that had no architecture and therefore no place to put it. Now it had a name and a face and a handwritten card in my drawer and a shape I could hold and eventually put down. That was not nothing. It was not enough. But it was not nothing. The house was quiet when I got home. Zale's car in the drive, ground floor lights off, which meant he was in his office. Bruschetta met me in the hallway and sat on my feet, and I stood there and let her and looked at the photograph on the wall of Zale holding my cat in the background of our first dance, and I thought about how a photograph can look exactly the same while everything around it changes. I went upstairs. Zale looked up when I came in. He read my face the way he always read my face, completely and without making a production of it, and he pushed his chair back slightly in the way that meant I could come in and be near him without having to explain myself first. I came in and sat on the corner of his desk. He put his hand on my back and left it there. I said, "I need to ask you something." He said, "All right." I said, "The drive. The encrypted section. Has anyone actually read what is inside it?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "No. We copied it and distributed it. The contents were not examined. That was deliberate. The less any one person knew about the specifics, the cleaner the switch structure." I said, "I want to read it." He said, "Seren." I said, "Not to use it. Not to change anything about the arrangement. I want to know what my father spent 20 years carrying. I want to know what this was actually about. All of it." He said, "It could be difficult to read." I said, "Most true things are." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "We would need your father's second access layer. We can't open our fragment without it, and even then our fragment is only a piece." I said, "Then we need to call my father." He said, "Tonight." I said, "Tonight." He looked at me for a moment with that particular quality he had of taking in everything before responding, and then he picked up his phone. Subscribe right now if you are not already subscribed, because what is inside that encrypted section of the archive is the thing that nobody in this story was prepared for, and it is the thing that changes how every single person in this kitchen understands themselves and each other. Comment below and tell me you are here. I need to know you are with me for this part. My father arrived at 9. Not with the canvas bag this time. Just himself in the wax jacket, concrete apparently being watched by the same neighbor who believed in the cousin story, and a quietness around him that was different from his usual quietness. More resolved. The quietness of someone who has decided that the time for holding things back has genuinely passed. He sat at the kitchen table and looked at both of us and said, "You want to open it?" I said, "Yes." He said, "I should tell you some things before you read it. Context. Things that will make what you find in their land differently if you know them first." I said, "All right." He said, "When I joined the organization, I was 31 years old, and I believed I was doing something that mattered. I want you to hold that. Not to excuse what came after, but to understand the before. I was not a cynical person who made cynical choices. I was a person who believed, genuinely, that the work had purpose." I said, "I believe you." He said, my first 3 years were straightforward by the standards of that world. I coordinated. I managed information. I understood what I was doing and why, and I was comfortable with most of it. And then I was given a new assignment. A coordination role on an operation that had been running for 2 years before I touched it, and that was described to me as a long-term asset development program. Zale was very still across the table. My father said, asset development is a term that covers a wide range of activities in that world. Recruitment, training, cultivation of sources. I was told this program identified individuals with particular aptitudes and tracked their development over time with a view to eventual recruitment. That was the description I was given. I said, and the reality? He said, the reality I did not fully understand until the 3rd year when I had enough access to see the complete picture. The subjects of the program were not adults. They were not people who had been identified as promising recruits in the conventional sense. He stopped. He put his hands flat on the table the way he had the night he arrived in the rain. The posture of a man steadying himself. He said, they were children. The program identified children, some as young as 7 or 8, who showed particular aptitude profiles. Stillness. Patience. The ability to observe without being observed. High perceptiveness. Low emotional display. The ability to be alone without distress. Children who fit this profile were logged in a database and monitored over years. School records, medical records, family circumstances. The intention was that when they reached adulthood, they would be approached for recruitment in a way that appeared organic, a natural discovery of a talented individual, when in fact they had been identified and tracked for 15 or 20 years. The kitchen was very quiet. I said, you coordinated this. He said, for 3 years. Without fully understanding what it was. And I want to be precise about that because I have spent 20 years being precise about it in my own head. I did not know the subjects were children when I took the assignment. I understood they were long-term prospects. I did not have full access to the subject files for the first 18 months. When I did get full access and understood what I was looking at, I spent 6 months documenting everything I could find, and then I began my exit negotiation. He said, I want you to know that I stopped. The moment I fully understood, I stopped cooperating and started planning to leave. I am telling you this not because it erases the 3 years, but because it is true and the truth of it matters to me. Zale said, very quietly, how many subjects were in the database? My father looked at him. He said, at the time I left. 43. Zale said, what happened to the database? My father said, it is in the encrypted section. The full database. Every name. Every file. Every year of monitoring. I took it when I left because I could not leave it behind for them to continue using, and I could not destroy it because the subjects deserve to know. If they ever wanted to know. Someday. Zale said nothing. My father looked at him with an expression I had not seen on his face before. Something careful and direct and carrying a weight I did not yet understand the shape of. He said, Zale, I need to ask you something and I need you to answer me honestly. Zale said, all right. My father said, where did you grow up? Zale said the name of a town. Small. Near a river. The town he had told me about over dinner on the Thursday after the name arrived. The town small enough that everyone knew what everyone else was carrying. My father closed his eyes for 1 second. When he opened them, he said, what was your mother's name? Zale said, why? My father said, please. A pause. Zale said his mother's name. My father reached into the inside pocket of his wax jacket, and he put his hand on the table, and when he lifted it there was a small worn photograph. Not the kind from a phone. Printed, old, slightly faded at the edges. A street scene. A small town. A woman walking with a child beside her, maybe 7 or 8 years old. The child's face turned slightly away from the camera. He slid it across the table toward Zale. Zale looked at it. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. I watched his face. I had learned to read Zale's face in the months since everything began, learned to see the things that moved beneath the surface of it that he had spent 10 years training himself not to show. And what I saw now was something I had not seen there before. Not shock exactly. Something more like the terrible clarity of a thing you have always half known without knowing that you half knew it. The the sensation of a shape you have been feeling in the dark finally being illuminated. He said, very quietly, that is me. My father said, yes. Zale said, how old? My father said, 7. That photograph was taken as part of routine monitoring. You were flagged at age 6 based on school reports that were passed to the program through a contact in the local education system. You were in the database for 11 years before I left. Zale put the photograph down. He said nothing. My father said, I did not know who you were when Seren brought you home. I did not connect the name. Zale is not common, but it is not impossible, and I had not looked at those files in 20 years. It was only after everything happened, after the arrangement, after I went home, and I could finally open the encrypted section for the first time in years and actually look at what was in it, that I found your file. He said, I have been deciding how to tell you since then. I said, how long have you known? He said, 3 weeks. The kitchen. The green mug on its hook. The little Italian stovetop pot on the back left burner. The loose third stair. Everything in its place. Everything ordinary. Everything that had been ordinary for 3 years and 4 months of a marriage that had been built, we now understood, on a foundation that went so much deeper than either of us had known to look. I looked at my husband. He was looking at the photograph on the table. At a 7-year-old child on a street in a small town near a river who had no idea that he had already been found. That the finding had started years before the organization would come to him with its offer that was not entirely an offer. That the stillness everyone had always noted in him, the quality his teachers called withdrawn and his mother called listening, had been identified and catalogued and considered an asset before he was old enough to understand what an asset was. I said, Zale. He looked up. I said, say what you are thinking. He said, I am thinking that I spent 10 years believing I was chosen because I was exceptional. Because I had a quality that made me valuable. And I am understanding now that the quality was identified when I was 6 years old by a program that my wife's father coordinated. And that the life I ended up living was not an accident of circumstance, but the conclusion of a process that started before I was old enough to choose anything. He said it without anger. That was the thing. Not flatly, not without feeling, but without anger. With the careful honesty of someone examining something true and refusing to look away from it. My father said, I am sorry. I know that is not sufficient. I know the distance between sorry and what I am sorry for is very large. But I am telling you because you deserve to know and because you have been in this family for 4 years without knowing it, and that is not right, and I could not let it continue. Zale looked at him for a long time. He said, did you know? When she brought me home. When you watched me with her for those months and made your decision not to say anything because whatever I had come to do I wasn't doing it. Did any part of you suspect? My father said, no. I promise you that. I saw the training. I saw the care. I did not see the child in the database. I had not looked at those files in 20 years and your face was a man's face, and I was looking at you through my daughter's eyes, and I saw someone who had made a choice to be different for her, and I trusted that. Zale said, you trusted it. My father said, yes. Zale said, even knowing what you knew about what that world does to people. My father said, because of what I knew. Because I had seen what that world does to people and I could see that you were fighting it. Every day. In every choice you made in that house. I could see the fight and I trusted the fighter. Something moved across Zale's face. Not the 2 millimeters of concession from the pharmacy. Something fuller than that. Something that had been held behind a very strong structure for a very long time and was now, quietly, being allowed to exist. He said, I used to count the sounds the river made when I couldn't sleep. When I was young. Before any of this. My father said, I know. It's in your file. Zale looked at the table. He said, they knew that. My father said, they documented everything. Zale said, and I thought counting was something I had found for myself. My father said nothing. Because there was nothing to say to that which would make it smaller than it was. I reached across the table and put my hand over Zale's. He turned his hand over and held mine. I said, the river is still yours. They watched you find it. That is not the same as finding it for you. The finding was yours. He looked at me. I said, everything you found for yourself is still yours. The counting. The stillness. The way you listen. They identified it. They did not create it. You were already that person before they ever looked at you. He said, very quietly, Seren. I said, I know. He said, that photograph. I am 7 years old in that photograph, and someone from this world was standing close enough to take it. I said, I know. He said, and then 30 years later I walked into a briefing room and opened a file and thought, not this one. I said, yes. He said, and the file was about the daughter of the man who coordinated the program that found me at 6 years old. I said, yes. He looked at the photograph on the table. At the child. At the street and the river town and the ordinary morning that had been documented without the child's knowledge or consent. He said, I want to be angry. I said, you can be angry. He said, I am angry. I said, I know. You are allowed to be angry for as long as you need to be. He looked at my father. My father held his gaze without flinching. The gaze of a man who has decided that whatever comes toward him from this direction, he will receive fully and without deflection because he has earned every bit of it. Zale said, I don't blame you. My father said nothing. Zale said, I want to be clear about that. I am angry at the program, at the organization, at the structure of it, at the 6-year-old in that photograph who is never going to be allowed to simply be a child who counted river sounds. I am angry at all of that. But I have sat across from you at that table, and I know who you are, and I know what you did when you understood what you were coordinating, and I am not going to give you blame you did not earn. My father said, you are more generous than I deserve. Zale said, I am accurate. There is a difference. Comment below right now and tell me what you felt when Zale said, I am accurate. There is a difference, because that line is the whole of him in 7 words, and I need to know if you felt it the way I feel it every time I think about it. Subscribe if you are not already here. Share this with one person who needs to read it. Because we are not finished yet, and what comes next is where this story finds the thing it has been looking for since the very first page. We sat at the kitchen table for a long time after that. My father made tea, which was a reversal of the usual order of things and which felt right in a way I didn't try to articulate. He moved around our kitchen with the careful respect of a guest who has been in the space enough times to know where things are, but not enough times to be careless about it. He found the mugs without asking. He knew where the tea was because I kept it in the same place my grandmother kept it, and he had told me once that he liked that continuity, and I had not known then why it moved him. I knew now. We sat, and we drank tea, and the conversation moved in the way conversations move after something enormous has been said and received, slowly, carefully, in smaller tributaries rather than the main river. Zale asked questions. Not the defensive questions of someone building a case, but the direct questions of someone who wants the full picture and intends to hold it clearly. What did the monitoring look like? Who had access to the files? How were the children approached when they reached adulthood? Were there others from the program who had been recruited and were still active? My father answered everything. At some point I got up and made more tea and stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the back garden in the dark, and I thought about the whiteboard that had been in this room 6 weeks ago, covered in lines and names, and the map of something we were trying to understand. The whiteboard was gone now, returned to the office, the lines erased. But the map was still there, just held differently, inside us rather than on a surface. I thought about a 6-year-old boy in a river town being documented without his knowledge. I thought about the same boy at 23 being given an offer that was not entirely an offer. I thought about him at 30-something in a briefing room opening a file and feeling something he could not name that made him think not this one before he knew anything about me at all. I thought about what it means that the feeling was real even though the circumstances around it were constructed. That the recognition was genuine even though the meeting was engineered. That he counted river sounds to slow himself down before anyone told him that quality was worth cataloging, and that he gave me his coat on a cold walk before anyone told him that impulse was worth acting on. I thought about how much of a person belongs to themselves when the world has been watching them since they were 6. And I thought the answer was everything that mattered. Everything that was real. Everything that chose and felt and decided and refused and held on. All of that was his. All of it. I turned back to the table. I said, I want to know about the other 42. Both of them looked at me. I said, the others in the database. There were 43 subjects when you left. Zale is one. There are 42 others. Where are they now? What happened to them? My father said, some were recruited. Some the program lost track of. Some aged out of the target profile. I don't know the current status of all of them. I said, but the files are in the archive. He said, yes. I said, then they can be found. And they can be told. If they want to know. My father said, Seren, that is not a small undertaking. I said, I know. He said, some of them may be active assets. Some may be in dangerous positions. Telling them could destabilize. I said, or it could give 42 people the chance to understand their own lives with full information. Which is what I would have wanted. Which is what Zale would have wanted. I looked at Zale. He said yes. One word. Flat and complete and entirely without hesitation. My father looked at both of us. He said, you understand this is years of work. I said, I'm an art teacher. I have patience and I am very good at working with incomplete information and chaotic materials. I think I can manage. My father looked at me for a long moment. He said, you sound like her again. I said, tell me about her properly sometime. He said, I will. I promise I will. I said, not tonight. He said, not tonight. Zale said, what do we need to start? And that was how it began. Not with a dramatic declaration or a formal decision or any of the orchestrated moments that stories are supposed to have at their turning points. Just 3 people at a kitchen table at 11 at night with cold tea and a wooden photograph and 42 names in an encrypted file and a decision that felt exactly the size it was, enormous and necessary and entirely possible. My father left at midnight. He stood in the hallway putting on his wax jacket and bruschetta came and sat on his feet the way she had taken to doing, her own version of a farewell that she would deny being sentimental about if anyone asked. He looked down at her. He said, all right then. He looked at me. He said, I am going to spend a long time making this right. I know that what right looks like is going to be defined by you and by Zale and not by me. I am ready for that. I said, I know, Dad. He said, call me Sunday. I said, you call me. First ring. He said, first ring. He looked at Zale. Something passed between them that did not need words and would have been diminished by them. The look of 2 people who have had something painful and true pass between them and have decided to stand on the other side of it together rather than apart. My father left. Zale and I stood in the hallway after the door closed and the quiet settled around us, the particular quiet of a house after people have left it, full rather than empty. He said, I want to see the river again. I said, the town you grew up in. He said, yes. I haven't been back. Not in 20 years. I think I want to go back now. I think I want to see it as myself rather than as whoever I was becoming when I left. I said, when? He said, when this is less immediate. When we've started on the files. When things are stable enough to leave for a weekend. I said, we'll go. He said, both of us. I said, obviously both of us. I am not letting you process 20 years of reconstructed personal history alone in a river town. I will be there with opinions and probably snacks. He said, obviously. I said, and bruschetta stays with my father. He said, obviously. I said, he needs the company anyway. He said, yes. We stood in the hallway. He said, I want to tell you something. I said, all right. He said, when I was in that briefing room and I opened the file and I saw your photograph and I thought not this one. I have always described that as instinct. As something I felt before I thought. I said, yes. He said, I think it was more than instinct. I think some part of me, a part that had been very quiet for 10 years, recognized something in your face. Not you specifically. I didn't know you. But something about the way you were standing in that photograph. Just walking. Head down. Bag on your shoulder. Completely unaware of being watched. He said, you looked like someone who was just being themselves without performing it. And I had spent 10 years performing everything, and I think some very tired part of me looked at your photograph and thought, I want to be near that. I want to be near someone who is just being themselves. I said, I was going to the pharmacy. He said, I know. I said, I had a migraine and I was stress eating. He said, I know. I said, not exactly a profound moment of authentic selfhood. He said, you were completely yourself. That was enough. I looked at him. I said, you are going to have to give me a moment. He said, take it. I took it. Then I said, "You gave me your coat because I looked cold." He said, "Yes." I said, "And canceled everything that night." He said, "Yes." I said, "And spent 3 years making breakfast and changing heating timers and coming home exactly when you said you would." He said, "Yes." I said, "For a person who is trained to be unreachable." He said, "You make it very difficult to be unreachable." I said, "Good." He said, "Extremely inconvenient." I said, "Good." He almost smiled. More than almost. The full version, quiet and complete and entirely his. I said, "Fix the third stair." He said, "The stair is a feature." I said, "The stair is a hazard." He said, "I've become attached to it." I said, "Zale." He said, "It reminds me that not everything needs to be perfect." I stopped. I said, "Say that again." He said, "The stair. It's loose. It's always been loose. And every time I mean to fix it, I walk past it and I think, this is a house where things don't have to be perfect. This is a house where something can be a little loose and still hold." He said, "I didn't have that before. A place where things could be imperfect and still hold. I want to keep the reminder." I stood in the hallway with the green mug on its hook visible through the kitchen doorway and the little Italian stovetop pot on the back left burner and the photograph on the wall of a man holding a cat in the background of a first dance, and I thought that I had spent 6 weeks dismantling a lie and rebuilding it into something true, and I had not once, not even in the worst moments, doubted that the thing underneath the lie was real. And it was. It was completely real. It was a loose stair and a heating timer and a man who counted river sounds and a woman who told a stranger the vitamins didn't work and something between them that had no name yet on a Tuesday in a pharmacy but already had weight. It still had weight. More than ever. Now that we knew the full cost of it. I said, "We'll leave the stair." He said, "Thank you." I said, "But I reserve the right to revisit this decision." He said, "Noted." I said, "Come to bed." He said, "Yes." We turned off the kitchen light. We went upstairs. Bruschetta preceded us at speed and was already in the center of the bed by the time we arrived, positioned with the geometric precision of an animal who has considered the territorial implications carefully and made a decision. Zale looked at her. She looked at him. He went to his side. She moved 3 inches. The negotiation was complete. I got into bed. He turned off the lamp. In the dark, he found my hand under the blanket the way he always had, and the way I had come to understand was not a habit but a choice, made every night to find me, to confirm I was there, to say without words the thing that all the words were always circling around. I said, "In the dark, Zale." He said, "Yes." I said, "The river sounds. When you couldn't sleep. What did they sound like?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Like something moving that knew exactly where it was going. Even in the dark. Even when you couldn't see it. You could hear it and know it was still going in the right direction." I said, "That's a good sound." He said, "Yes." I said, "When we go to the town, will you show me where you used to listen?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Good." I closed my eyes. The house was quiet around us. Outside, the November wind moved through the street the way it always did, indifferent and continuous, not knowing or caring about any of it. About the phone behind the headboard, or the photograph in the book, or the name in the envelope, or the file with 42 names, or a 7-year-old boy on a street being documented without his knowledge. Not knowing that the 7-year-old boy had grown up and found his way, by the most indirect and costly and improbable route imaginable, to this house, this bed, this hand in the dark. That was not nothing. It was, in fact, everything. Comment below right now and tell me what part of this broke you open the most. Tell me if it was the photograph of the 7-year-old. Tell me if it was the river sounds. Tell me if it was the stair. Subscribe if you have not. Tell one person about this story. Because there are 42 people in a file who do not yet know they were found before they ever had a chance to find themselves. And we are going to reach every single one of them. Please stay. We are not done. Not even close. The weekend we drove to Zale's river town, it rained the entire way there. Not dramatically. Not the kind of rain that announces itself with thunder and makes you feel like the weather is participating in your emotional journey. Just a steady, quiet, persistent rain that sat on the windscreen and turned the motorway gray and made the world outside the car feel soft at the edges, like something's still being decided. I had made snacks. I want that on record. I had made snacks the night before with the specific focused energy of a person who processes uncertainty through the preparation of food, a full bag of things, sandwiches cut properly. Not diagonally, because Zale had once mentioned in passing that diagonal sandwiches felt performative, fruit in a container, 2 thermos flasks of coffee made correctly, and a portion of something chocolate, because I am not a person who takes long drives without chocolate, and I refuse to apologize for that. Zale had looked at the bag when I brought it to the car and said nothing for a moment and then said, "You made sandwiches." I said, "I made sandwiches." He said, "It is a 3-hour drive." I said, "I am aware of how long the drive is." He said, "You made enough food for a week." I said, "I made enough food for a drive during which I intend to be comfortable. These are different quantities. Get in the car." He got in the car. Bruschetta was with my father. My father had collected her the previous evening, and she had gone with him with a dignity that suggested she had been expecting this invitation and had prepared accordingly. My father had looked at me on the doorstep and said, "Are you ready for this?" And I had said, "I've been ready for this since the vitamin aisle," which made him laugh in the way he was laughing more often now, fully, without the layer of something held back underneath it. The drive was quiet in the way our quiet had become, not empty but inhabited, full of the kind of comfortable silence that takes years to build and feels, once you have it, like the most valuable thing in a relationship. I watched the rain on the motorway and ate half a sandwich and thought about the file. We had been working on the file for 3 weeks. Not quickly. Carefully. The way you approach something that has the potential to change 42 lives, and therefore demands the same precision you would give to anything that matters that much. Vale was involved. She had resources and reach and the particular skill set of someone who had spent years inside a world that documented everything and knew exactly how documentation could be used in both directions. Of the 43 original subjects in the program, we had established the current status of 31. 12 were unlocatable so far, not dead, just moved, off-grid in the various ways people go off-grid when they are not looking to be found. Of the 31 we had located, 9 had been recruited by the organization and were currently active in various capacities. 14 had never been contacted. The program had apparently assessed them in adulthood and found them unsuitable or had simply lost the thread, and they were living entirely ordinary lives with no knowledge that they had ever been in a database. 8 had been approached and had declined, or had been approached and the approach had failed for various reasons. The 9 active ones were the complicated ones. The ones Vale was working on carefully, individually, with the patience of someone who understood that you do not simply tell a person that the life they've been living was constructed around them without first understanding what that information will do to them and what support they will need when it lands. Zale knew 3 of them. Not well. Professionally, from the periphery of his years as Ghost. He had not told me their names yet, and I had not asked, because I understood that some information needed to travel at its own pace, and I was learning, slowly and imperfectly, that my instinct to know everything immediately was not always the right instinct to follow. I was working on that. I said, in the car, somewhere around the 2nd hour, "Tell me something about where we're going." Something I wouldn't find if I looked it up. He was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet when he was actually thinking rather than deflecting. He said, "There is a bridge. Stone. Very old. It goes over the narrowest part of the river, and the sound it makes when the water is high and moving fast is different from any other part of the river. Deeper. More resonant. Like the water is being concentrated into something more itself." I said, "More itself." He said, "Like it knows it has less space, and so it becomes more of what it is rather than less." I said, "I want to hear that." He said, "It will probably be audible today. With the rain." I said, "Good." He said, "There is also a bakery. It has been there since before I was born, and it makes one specific thing perfectly, and everything else adequately, and everyone in the town knows which thing it is and orders accordingly." I said, "What is the one specific thing?" He said, "You'll have to wait." I said, "Zale." He said, "It's better if you don't know in advance." I said, That is an extremely unsatisfying answer. He said, most good things are unsatisfying in advance. That's what makes them good when they arrive. I looked at him. He was watching the road with the calm, focused attention he gave everything, hands easy on the wheel, the rain moving steadily across the glass. And there was something different about him today that I had been noticing since we left the house and had been trying to find the right word for. The word, I decided, was open. Not unguarded. Zale was constitutionally incapable of being fully unguarded, and I had made peace with that, and found I didn't mind it. The layers were part of him, and I had no interest in a version of him without depth. But open. Facing toward something rather than managing it from a careful distance. The way a person faces toward a place they have needed to return to for a long time and have finally given themselves permission to approach. I said, how does it feel? Going back. He said, strange. Like reading a sentence I wrote when I was very young and recognizing the handwriting, but not entirely the person who made it. I said, but you want to go. He said, I want to go as myself. That's the difference. Every time I thought about going back before, it felt like going back as Ghost. As the thing I had become. And I didn't want to take that into a place that belonged to the before version. I said, and now? He said, now I know the before version better than I did. And I think he deserves to be taken back to where he started. I said nothing. I just put my hand on his arm for a moment and left it there, and he didn't move or acknowledge it in any obvious way, but his shoulders dropped about 2 millimeters, and that was enough. If you are in the car with us right now, metaphorically, then you know what I am about to tell you is the part of the story I have been building toward since the very first page. And I need you to subscribe and comment before we arrive, because once we get to that town and that bridge and that bakery, the story is going to move fast, and it is going to ask things of you emotionally that you deserve to be prepared for. Like this. Subscribe, comment, and tell me you're in the car with us. We arrived at 11:30. The town was exactly as small as he had described it and exactly as unassuming, the kind of place that does not perform its own charm but simply exists in it. Old stone buildings and narrow streets and a high street with the same shops it has probably had for 40 years, and a sky that was beginning to release the rain into something lighter, not quite clearing but considering it. Zale drove through it slowly. Not hesitantly. Deliberately. The way you move through a place you are reading rather than just passing through. I watched his face. He passed a school, and something in his expression did the almost imperceptible thing. The 2 millimeters of acknowledgement, and I noted it and said nothing. He passed a library, and the same thing happened, and I said, the library. He said, I spent a lot of time there. I said, counting things. He said, reading mostly. The counting came later. When I needed something to do with my hands. He turned a corner, and the road opened slightly, and there it was. The river. Even in the subdued November light, it was beautiful in the particular way that moving water is always beautiful, the way it insists on itself, on its own direction and momentum, indifferent to the weather and the season and the fact that it was being observed. It moved through the town with the quiet authority of something that had been here long before the town and would be here long after. Zale parked near the bank. We got out. The air was cold and clean and smelled like water and wet stone and the particular scent of a place that is very old and very certain of itself. I stood beside him on the bank and looked at the river, and I could hear it, a low continuous sound, not loud but everywhere, filling the spaces between other sounds the way a held note fills a room. I said, I can hear it. He said, yes. I said, you counted this. He said, I tried to. You can't really count it. It's not discrete. It's continuous. I think what I was actually doing was listening to it so completely that there was no room left in my head for anything else. I said, that's a good technique. He said, it's the original technique. Everything else I tried afterward was just a version of this. We stood there for a while. The rain had softened to almost nothing, just a presence rather than a fall. And the river moved in front of us with its continuous, uninterruptible sound, and I thought about a 6-year-old boy standing on this bank listening, and not knowing that he was being watched, and not knowing what was coming, and just being, for now, himself, on a bank with a river. I thought about how much of him was still that boy. I thought about how much of anyone is still the child they were before the world got opinions about them. I took his hand. He looked at me. I said, "Thank you for bringing me here." He said, "Thank you for coming." I said, "There was never a version where I didn't come." He said, "I know. I'm saying thank you anyway." We walked to the bridge. It was stone, as he had said, old and solid and covered in the kind of moss that takes decades to establish, the bridge of a place that has not needed to prove anything to anyone for a very long time. We stood on it and looked down at the water moving underneath, and the sound was exactly what he had described, deeper, more concentrated, the river becoming more itself in the narrower space. He stood there for a long time. I stood next to him and let him have it, the full weight of returning. The full complexity of standing in a place that belongs to the before version of yourself when you are the after version, and seeing whether the two can exist in the same location without one of them disappearing. They could. I could see it in the way he breathed. He said, eventually, quietly, almost to the river rather than to me, "I used to think the river was going somewhere important. When I was young, I used to think if you followed it far enough you would arrive somewhere that mattered." I said, "Where did it go?" He said, "To a larger river. And then to the sea." I said, "That's somewhere that matters." He said, "I know that now. I didn't know it then. Then I just thought it was going somewhere better than here, and I wanted to follow it." I said, "Did you follow it?" He said, "In a way. Just not the direction I thought I was going." I said, "You ended up at a pharmacy on a Tuesday." He said, "I ended up at a pharmacy on a Tuesday." I said, "With a woman eating a granola bar." He said, "With a woman eating a granola bar who told me the vitamins didn't work." I said, "They don't." He said, "I know." I said, "The river brought you there." He looked at me. I said, "Not literally. But the boy on the bank listening to the water. The stillness he built. The patience. The way he learned to be inside something completely without being swept away by it. That boy built the person who stood in a briefing room and felt something he couldn't name when he looked at a photograph. The river didn't just go to the sea, Zale. It went to the pharmacy on a Tuesday." He was very still. I said, "Everything they tried to take from you. The counting. The listening. The stillness. They cataloged it, and they used it, and they thought that meant it belonged to them. But it started here. On this bank. Before any of them. And it is still here. And it is still yours." He looked at the river for a long moment. Then he looked at me and said, very quietly, "I love you." He said it the way he said everything that mattered. Without volume. Without performance. With the complete certainty of someone who has examined a thing from every angle and arrived at it as a conclusion rather than a feeling. I said, "I know." He said, "I have not said it enough." I said, "You have said it in every other possible way for 4 years." He said, "I am saying it in this way now." I said, "I love you too. I have loved you since the vitamin aisle, and I want that known officially and permanently." He said, "It is known." I said, "Good." He said, "Officially and permanently." I said, "Now take me to the bakery." He almost laughed. Almost. And then he actually did, low and brief and completely real, and it went into the air above the river, and the river kept moving underneath us, carrying it somewhere important. We walked to the bakery. It was exactly as he had described. Small, warm, smelling of something that I cannot describe accurately except to say it smelled like the concept of comfort given physical form. The woman behind the counter looked at Zale with the particular expression of someone who recognizes a face they have not seen for a very long time and is deciding how to approach the recognition. She said, in a tone that landed somewhere between surprise and the complete absence of it, "You came back then." He said, "I came back." She looked at me. He said, "This is my wife." She looked at me for a moment with the assessing warmth of a person who has known someone since childhood and is measuring the person that childhood produced against the person standing in front of her now. She said to me, "He used to come in here every Saturday when he was small. Always ordered the same thing. Never changed his mind once in about 6 years." I said, "What did he order?" She said, "The almond thing. We only make it Saturdays. Has done since before his time and will do after mine." She put 2 of them on the counter. I looked at Zale. He said, "I told you it was better not to know in advance." I tasted it. He was right. It was the one specific thing the bakery made perfectly and everything else adequately, and I understood completely why a child would come in every Saturday for 6 years and never change his mind. We sat in the bakery at a small table near the window, and the rain had fully stopped outside, and the town was doing what small towns do after rain, becoming more itself, the stone darker and cleaner, the river audible even from here. The light beginning to find its way through the clouds in the specific golden way it finds its way through after a long gray morning. I said, "Tell me one more thing. From before." "Something small." He said, "My mother used to sing when she cooked." Not well. Completely unself-consciously. Like there was no version of the activity that didn't include the singing, and the quality of the singing was entirely beside the point. I said, "Do you cook like that?" He said, "I cook in silence." I said, "You could cook with music." He said, "I could." I said, "We could try it." He said, "We could." I said, "Sunday. I will put something on and you will make the eggs and we will see what happens." He said, "And if the eggs suffer?" I said, "Then the eggs suffer and we order something and it will still have been worth it." He said, "The eggs won't suffer." I said, "No, they won't, because you are constitutionally incapable of making bad eggs." He said, "That is possibly the most specific compliment I have ever received." I said, "I mean it with my whole heart." He said, "I know you do." We sat in the bakery until the light outside had fully settled into a clean, bright afternoon, and the town moved around us in its unhurried way, and nobody looked at us or noted us or cared about us in any particular direction, and it was the most ordinary and the most extraordinary morning I had ever had. Do not go anywhere, because this is the part of the story where we come home, and what waits for us at home is the thing that closes every open thread and answers the last question, and does it in a way that I did not plan and could not have planned, because life, it turns out, does not wait for you to plan it. It just happens. At exactly the right time. In exactly the right kitchen. Comment below. Subscribe. Tell me you are still here. We drove home in the afternoon light. The rain was entirely gone, and the motorway had dried to a flat gray shine, and the sky was the color it gets in November when it finally commits to clarity after a long, uncertain morning. I ate the rest of the chocolate. Zale had half a sandwich. We talked about small things, and the small things felt, as they had been feeling increasingly since the night my father sat at the kitchen table with the photograph and told the truth, like the actual substance of life, rather than the filler between the important parts. I had learned that, late but genuinely, that the small things were not waiting for the important things to finish. They were the important things. The heating timer. The green mug. The Saturday almond thing from a bakery in a river town. These were not footnotes. They were the text. We got home at 4. My father's car was in the drive. I said he wasn't supposed to come until tomorrow. Zale said no. We looked at each other. Not with alarm. We had graduated, I think, from the immediate alarm response to something more measured, the recognition that unexpected things happened, and some of them were bad and some of them were not, and the only way to find out which was to go inside. We went inside. My father was in the kitchen. Bruschetta was on the table, which was not allowed, and my father was not removing her, which told me he had been here long enough to have accepted the table as her territory without a fight. He was sitting with his hands around a mug of tea, and he looked up when we came in with an expression I had not seen on his face before. Not frightened. Not urgent. Something softer than that and more complicated. The expression of someone who has been sitting with a decision for a long time and has finally arrived at the other side of it. I said, "Dad, what happened?" He said, "Nothing bad." I want to say that first. Nothing bad has happened. I said, "All right." He said, "Sit down. Both of you. I have something to tell you, and I want to tell it properly." We sat down. He looked at his tea for a moment. Then he looked at me. He said, "I told you about your mother. About who she was before she was your mother. About the organization and the work and the exit. I told you she left when you were 3 months old and came home and was married and was at peace." I said, "Yes." He said, "I told you that I believed her death was natural. That I had looked at it from every angle and believed it was what the doctors said it was." I said, "Yes." He said, "I've been continuing to look. Since everything happened. Since we built the switch and the arrangement was made and I had access to things I hadn't had access to in years. I have been looking at everything connected to that period with everything I now know and everything Vale's network has been able to surface. He paused. He said, her death was natural. I am now certain of that. Completely, evidentially, documentably certain. The medical records are consistent, and I have had them reviewed by 2 independent sources through Vale, and the conclusion is the same. She died of what they said she died of, and there was no intervention and no organization involvement. I let out a breath I did not know I had been holding since the night he first raised the uncertainty about it. I said, okay. He said, I wanted you to have certainty. Not my belief. Certainty. I said, thank you. He said, that is not all. He reached into the inside pocket of his wax jacket. I thought, not for the first time, that jacket had produced more significant objects from its inside pocket in the last 2 months than most people's filing cabinets produced in a decade. He put something on the table. It was a letter. Not in an envelope. Folded, handwritten, several pages, the paper slightly yellowed at the edges in the way paper yellows when it has been kept carefully in one place for a very long time. He said, your mother wrote this when you were approximately 18 months old. She gave it to me and said, if anything happens to me before she is old enough to understand, give her this when the time is right. He said, I have been deciding when the time was right for 32 years. He said, I think the time is right. He pushed it across the table to me. I looked at it. I looked at my father. He said, take your time. I'll be outside. He stood up. He picked up his tea. He looked at Zale with the look they had developed over the past weeks, the shorthand of 2 people who have passed through something difficult together and arrived at a mutual respect that neither of them would call warmth yet, but that was heading, unmistakably, in that direction. He went outside. Bruschetta watched him go and then turned and looked at me with her amber eyes. I looked at the letter on the table. Zale said, do you want me to? I said, stay. He said, yes. I picked up the letter. My mother's handwriting was nothing like mine. Mine was loose and gestural, the handwriting of someone who thought faster than her hand and had given up trying to make them match. Hers was careful and even, each letter fully formed, the handwriting of someone who thought carefully about what they were putting down before they put it down. I read it. I am not going to give you every word of it because some things belong only to the person they were written for. But I will tell you what she said because it is the final piece of the story and it deserves to exist in the light. She wrote about leaving the organization. Not the official version, the negotiated exit, the archived insurance, but the interior version, the one that happened inside her while the exterior one was being arranged. She wrote about understanding that she had spent years being useful in ways that had cost other people things they had not agreed to give. She wrote about the specific weight of that understanding and how it did not crush her but changed her, the way pressure changes the structure of something without destroying it. She wrote about my father. About loving him in the complicated way you love someone you found in a context that was not entirely honest and had to find again in a context that was. About how the second finding was better than the first because it was chosen without any incentive except itself. She wrote about me. About holding me and thinking, here is a person who has no idea what the world is capable of, and I have a finite amount of time to give her everything she needs to be able to face it on her own terms. She wrote about what she wanted for me. Not safety exactly, she was too honest for safety as a primary wish. Something more like capacity. The capacity to face true things without being destroyed by them. The capacity to love without requiring the thing you love to be perfect. The capacity to find the third option when everyone else was only seeing 2. And then at the end she wrote something that I read 3 times before I was able to move past it. She wrote, I do not know who you will become or who you will love or what the world will ask of you. But I know this. You will pay attention. You always have, even now, even at 18 months old, you watch everything with those enormous eyes and you miss nothing and you file it all away, and I think that is your greatest gift, and I want you to know that it is yours entirely. Nobody gave it to you. Nobody can take it. It was always just you, watching, understanding, finding the shape of things before anyone told you the shape was there to find. Use it carefully. Use it kindly. And use it in the direction of the people who deserve it. You will know who they are. You have always known who deserves your attention. Trust that. I put the letter down. The kitchen was very quiet. Zale was looking at me with an expression I will carry for the rest of my life, full and careful and completely present. I said, she knew. He said, yes. I said, she wrote this 32 years ago and she knew. He said, she knew you. I said, she said I would know who deserves my attention. He said, yes. I said, she was right. He said nothing. He just held my gaze the way the river held its banks, continuously, without effort, because it was simply what it was and had no other way to be. I folded the letter carefully. I held it for a moment. Then I got up and I went to the back door and opened it, and my father was sitting on the step in his wax jacket in the late afternoon light, and Bruschetta was next to him, pressed against his leg, doing her version of comfort, which was to simply be present without making a fuss about being present. I sat down on the step on his other side. We sat there, the three of us, looking at the garden in the November light, and it was cold and it smelled like rain, and the garden looked like it always looked at this time of year, dormant and patient, waiting for spring to tell it what to do next. My father said, well. I said, well. He said, she was right about you. I said, she was right about a lot of things. He said, yes. I said, she was right about Zale too. In her way. He looked at me. I said, she wrote that I would know who deserves my attention. She said I always have. And she was right. I knew when I found that phone that whatever the truth was, I was going to go toward it rather than away from it. I knew when I sat across from Seren in that coffee shop that I was going to take the information and use it rather than be used by it. I knew when you arrived in the rain that the time for carrying things alone was over. I said, and I knew in the vitamin aisle. I knew before I knew anything about him. Something in me went, that one. Pay attention to that one. My father said, your mother did the same thing. She looked at people and knew. I said, I know. She told me. He looked at the letter in my hands. He said, I should have given it to you sooner. I said, you gave it to me exactly when I could receive it fully. I don't think I could have understood it before all of this. He said, perhaps. I said, definitely. 2 months ago, I was a woman who thought she was married to a man who worked in logistics. I did not have the full context for this letter. I do now. He said, what will you do with it? I said, read it when I need to. Keep it where I can find it. Let it be what it is. He nodded. We sat in the garden. After a while, Zale came and stood in the doorway and looked out at us, and I looked back at him, and he said, I'm going to start dinner. My father said, without looking around, I'll stay. Zale said, I was counting on it. He went back inside. My father looked at the garden. He said, he is a good man. I said, I know. He said, what he came from. What they made of him. What he made of himself in spite of it. That is not a small thing. I said, no. He said, and the way he looks at you. I said, Dad. He said, I'm just saying. A father notices. I said, a father who spent 20 years growing tomatoes and pretending to be a civil engineer notices. He said, an especially observant father. I said, evidently. He said, she would have liked him. I said, she already knew to like him. She just didn't know it was him yet. He looked at me. I said, she cared about the people who were worth reaching. She tried to reach them even when the system made it impossible. Zale was worth reaching. She just couldn't get there in time. So I went instead. My father looked at the garden for a long time. Then he said, very quietly, thank you for that. I said, it's the truth. He said, I know. Thank you for it anyway. The kitchen light came on behind us as the afternoon began to make its way toward evening, warm and gold through the window, and the smell of something cooking reached us on the step, slow and patient and completely deliberate. The smell of a man who had learned that care was not a performance, but a practice, and had been practicing it every day for 4 years. I stood up. I held out my hand to my father. He looked at it for a moment, and then he took it and stood up, and we went inside. Zale was at the stove. The kitchen was warm. Bruschetta jumped onto the table, and my father removed her with the resigned efficiency of a man who has accepted this outcome as inevitable and has chosen his battles accordingly. I set the table. My father sat down and watched Zale cook with the expression he had been developing over the past weeks, the careful, appreciative expression of someone learning to see a person whole rather than in the filtered version they had been seeing before. He said, to Zale's back, "She tells me you went to the town today." Zale said, "Yes." My father said, "How is it?" Zale said, "Smaller than I remembered." The river was the same. My father said, "Rivers usually are." Zale said, "Yes." My father said, "Good bones, rivers. They don't need to be anything other than what they are." Zale turned and looked at him. Something passed between them. Not the look of two careful men conducting a mutual assessment. Something past that. Something that had arrived at the other side of assessment and found, perhaps unexpectedly, that it liked what it saw. Zale said, "I'm going to fix the third stair next weekend." I said, from the other side of the kitchen, "I did not ask you to do that." He said, "I know." I said, "You said it was a feature." He said, "I changed my mind." I said, "You said it reminded you that things don't have to be perfect." He said, "I don't need the reminder anymore." I stopped setting the table. He said, still facing the stove, "I know what that feels like now. From the inside. I don't need the stair to remind me. I have it." My father was looking between the two of us with the expression of a man at a tennis match who knows he is watching something that has nothing to do with tennis. I said, "Zale." He said, "Yes." I said, "That is possibly the most romantic thing you have ever said to me, and you said it about a stair." He said, "The stair was a good vehicle." I said, "I'm going to need a moment." He said, "Take it." I took it. Then I finished setting the table and sat down, and my father poured 3 glasses of something he had brought from his house, because he was a man who understood that certain evenings required the right bottle and had planned accordingly. Zale brought dinner to the table. We ate. And I want to tell you about that dinner. Not the food, though the food was perfect in the way his food was always perfect, but the texture of the evening itself. The quality of 3 people sitting around a table who had come to where they were sitting by the most indirect and costly and improbable route and had arrived, finally, at something that felt like what it was supposed to feel like all along. My father talked about my mother. For the first time, properly, not the edited version, not the version that protected me from complexity, but the real version. The woman who recruited him in a library and fell in love with him against her professional better judgment and left the organization for a child who was 18 months old and had enormous eyes that missed nothing. He talked about her laugh, about the way she cooked, about the fact that she had an opinion about everything and delivered every opinion with the same calm certainty regardless of how minor the subject was, equal conviction about international affairs, and the correct way to fold a fitted sheet. I listened to every word. Zale listened the way he listened to everything, completely and without interruption, and at some point during the telling he reached under the table and found my hand and held it, not drawing attention to it, just present, just there. My father noticed. I could see him notice. He noticed and said nothing, and the not saying anything was its own kind of everything. After dinner we sat at the table for a long time, the way you sit at a table when nobody wants to be the one who ends the evening, because the evening is exactly what it should be, and ending it feels like a small loss even though you know it will come back tomorrow. At some point my father looked at both of us and said, "I want to say something." We looked at him. He said, "I spent 22 years carrying things alone because I believed that was the only way to carry them safely. I believed that sharing the weight meant risking the people I shared it with. I told myself it was protection." He said it wasn't. It was fear. Fear that if I put it down someone would see what I had been carrying and decide it was too much. That the years and the decisions and the cost of all of it was too much to stand next to. He said, "What I know now is that the people who love you do not want to be protected from the weight. They want to be trusted with it. And the weight, when it is shared, does not crush anyone. It distributes. It becomes something you carry together, and in the carrying of it together you build something that could not exist any other way." He looked at Zale. He said, "You knew that before I did. You chose this woman completely, with full knowledge of what the complete choice cost, and you carried it alone for 3 years out of a love that was, whatever its origin, entirely real. And I should have seen that sooner and trusted it sooner, and I am saying so now, because I don't want there to be things between us that were true and unsaid." Zale said, "There aren't." My father said, good. Zale said, for what it's worth. The 3 years I carried it alone. I would do it again. Not the secrecy, that was wrong and I will not pretend otherwise. But the choosing. Every day of the choosing. I would do all of it again. I said, you are both going to make me cry, and I have a strict policy against crying at the dinner table. My father said, you cried at the hamster naming resolution. I said, that was a very emotional week and Gerald deserved that response. Zale said, you cried at the sourdough commercial. I said, that commercial was manipulative and the bread looked very good. My father said, you cried at the end of the nature documentary about the... I said, we are not discussing the documentary. They looked at each other. It was the first time they had looked at each other like that, with the shared amusement of two people who had independently and at different times discovered the same thing about a person they both loved and were now comparing notes in real time. I said, I am surrounded by people who are ganging up on me and I want that noted. My father said, noted. Zale said, noted. Bruschetta, from the counter she had colonized after being removed from the table, blinked. I said, and the cat. And I laughed. Fully, the way Cleo used to laugh, with everything, and it felt like the right way to laugh at that table in that kitchen on that evening. And I thought Cleo would have found all of this both completely outrageous and deeply satisfying, and she would have had opinions about every part of it, and I would have listened to every single opinion and argued with at least half of them, and we would have been on the phone until midnight. I held that thought. I let it be what it was. Not only grief anymore. Something more complete than that. Grief and love existing in the same space the way they always do when they are both real. Neither one canceling the other, both of them true at the same time. I thought, I will tell Gerald about you on Monday. He is a good listener. He runs on his wheel and he listens and he never judges anything. I thought she would have found that very funny. My father left at 10. He stood at the door and hugged me for a long time without saying anything, and I let him, and it felt like 32 years of something completing itself in the simple fact of being held by a parent who had put down what he was carrying long enough to use both arms. He shook Zale's hand. And then, in a motion that surprised both of them and which neither of them commented on, he pulled him briefly into an embrace, one hand on the back of his shoulder, and then stepped back and cleared his throat and said, Sunday then, and walked to his car. Bruschetta watched from the hallway. We closed the door. The house was quiet. Zale and I stood in the hallway in the quiet, and I looked at the photograph on the wall, the one of him holding my cat in the background of our first dance. And I thought about the first time I had hung it there, and how I had looked at it every morning since, and how the same photograph had been, at various points in the last 2 months, a comfort and a question and an accusation and a mystery and an answer. Tonight it was just what it had always been underneath all of those things. Two people at the beginning of something, caught in a photograph by a woman who brought a cat to a wedding because she thought it was funny, which it was, and which it would always be. And which was exactly the kind of thing that made a life, rather than a sequence of events. I said, Cleo would have had so much to say about all of this. Zale said, what would she have said? I said, at the beginning, when I first found the phone, she would have said, I told you so in the most loving possible way. She would have said it at length. She would have had specific callbacks to the night she told me he had an energy she couldn't name, and she would have deployed each one with precision. Zale said, and then. I said, and then she would have listened to all of it. Every part. The whole thing from the vitamin aisle to the river town to the bakery to the almond thing. And she would have listened with her whole self the way she always did. And at the end she would have said something that reframed the entire story in a single sentence and made me see it differently. I said, and I've been trying to figure out what that sentence would have been. Zale said, what do you think it would have been? I was quiet for a moment. I said, I think she would have looked at all of it. The assignment, and the fourth date, and the photograph, and the stand down, and the switch, and the river, and the 42 names, and my father, and the letter, and all of it. And she would have looked at me and she would have said, you know what this is, right? This is just a love story. A completely ridiculous, overcomplicated, deeply inconvenient love story. But that is all it is. And that is enough. Zale was quiet. I said, she would have been right. He said, she usually was. I said, she really was. We stood in the hallway for a moment longer. Then I said, come to bed. He said, yes. We went upstairs. Bruschetta preceded us at speed and was in the center of the bed before we reached the doorway. I said, Bruschetta. She looked at me. I said, every night. Every single night. She blinked. Slowly. With complete satisfaction. Zale said, she has done this for 4 years. I said, I am aware. He said, the negotiation always ends the same way. I said, the negotiation always ends the same way because she wins every time and she knows it. He said, she does. He went to his side. She moved 3 inches. The terms were accepted. I got into bed. He turned off the lamp. In the dark, he found my hand under the blanket. I said, Sunday. He said, Sunday. I said, you cook with music. He said, I cook with music. I said, and we call my father at 11. He said, first ring. I said, and next weekend you fix the stair. He said, I fix the stair. I said, and sometime in the spring we go back to the river. He said, we go back to the river. I said, and the 42 names. He said, one at a time. Carefully. With Vale. I said, yes. I said, and Cleo. He said, Dave and Rel will not be making decisions from a position of freedom for a long time. That is done. That is finished. I said, yes. I said, she is the best of us. He said, yes. I said, still. He said, always. The house was quiet around us. Outside, the November wind moved through the street with its usual indifference, and somewhere in the distance the city continued its continuous, uninterruptible life, and none of it knew, and all of it continued anyway, which was exactly right. Which was exactly how it should be. I thought about my mother writing a letter to an 18-month-old child and trusting that the child would grow into someone who could receive it fully. I thought about my father in his river town growing tomatoes and waiting for the past to stay buried long enough that it wouldn't become his daughter's problem, and how it had become her problem anyway, and how she had turned it into something he could put down. I thought about a 6-year-old boy on a bank listening to a river and not knowing he was being watched and not knowing what was coming and just being, right now, himself, with the water, counting something that couldn't be counted, which was maybe the point. I thought about Cleo saying the 2 things aren't mutually exclusive, babe. I thought about the vitamin display and the 2 millimeters and the coat on the 4th date and the heating timer and the green mug and the stand down at 2 in the morning and the photograph and the phone and the archive and the switch and the river and the bakery and the almond thing and a letter in my mother's handwriting that had been waiting 32 years for the right moment to be read. I thought about how none of it was simple and all of it was worth it. I thought about Cleo being right. This is just a love story. A completely ridiculous, overcomplicated, deeply inconvenient love story. But that is all it is. And it is enough. It is more than enough. It is everything. And that is where I will leave it. Not because the story is over. Stories like this are never entirely over. There are 42 names and a spring visit to a river and a Sunday with music in the kitchen and 1,000 mornings of eggs and sourdough and the green mug still to come. But because this is the part where the story becomes a life rather than a story. And lives don't need an ending. They just need to keep going. In the right direction. Like a river that knows where it is going even in the dark. Even when you can't see it. You can hear it. And you know it is still going the right way. Thank you for being here for all of it. Every single part. From the vitamin aisle to the river. This was always for you. Like this if you stayed until the end. Subscribe if you want to know what comes next for all of us. Comment below and tell me which part of this story you will carry with you, because I genuinely want to know. I read every single one. And tell one person. Just one. Because somewhere out there is someone who needs a story worth staying up for. And this was always that. From the very first Tuesday. From the very first granola bar. It was always that.